So, what books should we read? That sounds like a kind of a basic question, doesn't it? Today's show explores the idea of a canon, a Western canon. Is there a set of books that is essential? How navigable and how negotiable is that idea? How often does it change? How much consensus is there? Are there ways in which it has had to become sensitive to issues of previous exclusion of women's voices, voices from people of color? You get the idea. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about, and we have terrific guests here, and towards the end we'll tell you about kind of the future of your relationship with the Western canon when you can ask an AI version of a famous literary expert to talk about The Great Gatsby or Romeo and Juliet just with you and answer your questions. I don't get it either, but let's talk about it after the news.
Socrates went to the market. They said to come on in. Yeah, Socrates went to the market. Look what they did to him. He had a little cup of wisdom and a little cup of wine. He had a little cup of hemlock and he counted up to 9. Socrates, infinite.
All right, we are going to have a conversation today about what is often referred to as the Western canon, a.k.a. the core curriculum, a.k.a. great books. These are all slightly different terms, but they point towards the same idea, which is that there's some basic group of materials in literature that one should absorb. But maybe I'm not even saying that right. Actually, our guest will do so much better. Joining us right now is James Mustick, author of 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die, and Roosevelt Montaz, a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University, the author of Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life, and Why They Matter for a New Generation. Roosevelt Montaz, I'm going to start with you. There's a conversation that I think is a little different than the one we're about to have that erupts around 1987. You've got E.D. Hirsch putting out Cultural Literacy. You've got J. Allen Bloom putting out The Closing of the American Mind. Hirsch is a little bit more, relaxed and friendly in his suggestion that there's just some stuff that you probably ought to know that's just kind of the bedrock for not only cultural conversations, but maybe also even a societal cohesion. Bloom is a little bit more, get off my lawn with your modern stuff and your pop music and your relativism and your postmodernism. But he's making a very similar argument, chiming in, maybe Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Saul Bellow, Bill Bennett. But these are all people talking, I think, about cultural cohesion. I don't think that's what you're talking about so much here. You're really talking about the individual student and reader and what that person theoretically might benefit from having as kind of a starting basis, the basic ingredients. But say some more about how you see that.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. It's great to be here and great to be part of this conversation, which is an important conversation. I think that sort of the part that I emphasize, the approach that I emphasize, which focuses on the individual and the way that an education of this kind, exposure to some of the most fundamental, important, defining ideas of our civilization, the way that can empower an individual, the way that it can transform your life, deepen your experience of humanity, make you more effective agent of change, make you a more effective member of a community, is not separate, is not really a true contrast to the sort of broader idea of something like cultural capital, something that our civilization, our culture, our politics, in fact, functions on the basis of a set of norms, ideas, conventions, institutions, which have a history, which have an evolution and a development, and that the greater facility and awareness you have of that evolution, that those foundations, the more effective you will be at functioning within their contemporary manifestations. So the two arguments go together. Although clearly the sort of broader cultural argument that some of the figures that you mentioned, Bloom and Hirsch, advance, has become politically coded, has become sort of right-wing coded in our contemporary environment, and that's one of the things that I think we have to push back against, because a liberal education, the great books, the intellectual tradition that we inherit is not political in the terms of our current polarized cultural divide. It is political at a much deeper level, one that is relevant to every member of our political community, every citizen of our country.
Yeah, I mean, we should say it was politicized in 1987. That was, I mean, most of those people were making an essentially political argument, and they were coming at it from the right. And I just want to stay with you for a second about this too. I mean, in your book, Socrates / Plato, Gandhi, Augustine, these are people that I'm leaving somebody out. Freud. I'm blocking on Freud. That's interesting, blocking on Freud.
Very interesting.
It's very Freudian. But you start with them, and there's a little bit of know thyself in that quartet. But say a little bit more.
All of those texts and all of those writers are concerned with this question of self-knowledge, of knowing yourself. Socrates' most famous dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living. And St. Augustine writes essentially autobiography, the first autobiography in our canon, if you want to say. Because my sense is that the self is the most sort of direct tool, direct point of access we have into the broader world. So by emphasizing the ways in which this tradition prompts and equips you for self-reflection, I'm not saying that you should just be self-obsessed, that you should be sort of egotistical and narcissistically self-centered. It's that the self turns out to be a sort of mysterious field whose investigation in fact opens up the whole world. It is our access point, and it is usually too self-confident and simplistic an account of our own self that prevents us from seeing the world. So there is a long and sustained philosophical, literary, aesthetic, spiritual emphasis on self-exploration in the Western tradition, and not only in the Western tradition, clearly in other traditions as well, that I think is one of the great values, one of the great benefits, one of the great treasures that the tradition confers on us.
Jim Mustick, in your book, which, by the way, I left it on my desk. I didn't bring it in here. I don't know why, but I have it within arm's reach of me in my home office at all times. And it's 1,000 books. Let's set aside the 999 of them. One of them, the one by Bernard Knox, is kind of about the conversation that we were just having. I mean, there is, in your view, an essential book about that whole question of whether or not dead white males should dominate the canon. I don't know. Just say a little bit about how you're thinking about what's been said so far.
Well, I would pick up on first of all, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I want to pick up on Roosevelt was talking about the self. And in that Bernard Knox book, he makes a comment that you can, throw human nature out the door and it'll come back through the window. And a lot of this is about, for me, these books about human nature, and about two conversations that we have: the conversation that we have to learn to have with the world, but also the longest and most important conversation we have in our lives, which is the conversation in our own heads. Mm-hmm. As we're talking to ourselves. And as Roosevelt was saying, the books that are in the Western canon or in a canon or adjacent to the canon can inform that conversation. And to me, it's not just about the ideas in the books or mastering the content in the books. It's about something else. If I may tell a little story,
sure,
because I'm thinking about this since I knew it was going to be on the show. Saturday morning, I was at the Peabody Museum of Natural History in New Haven with my grandkids, who are 5 and 3. And one of the exhibits was labeled "The Oldest Book in the World." and there were clay tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, actual tablets that have lasted 4,000 years on which this story is encoded. And that story is about a man who his friend dies. He goes searching for him in the underworld, has to pass through this magical forest where there is a big monster. My 5-year-old grandson, Charlie, particularly liked the monster because there was a tablet with the monster there. And this book asks kind of basic questions. When I was giving a talk when my book came out, somebody asked me, you have a perspective that not all of us have, having kind of tried to traverse literature from the beginnings up to the present day, more or less, and spottily. What did you learn from that? What can you share? And that was a great question. The first thing I learned from it, that it was a very hubristic enterprise. But the second thing was that from the beginning and repeated like recurring melodies played on different instruments for different forces, we find the same questions. Why are we here? What does it mean to be here? Why do we die? How do we live in the face of mortality? Why do we suffer? What makes us happy? How do we weather the loss that is our lot? And how can we hold on to joy and love and purpose and desire despite that? And those questions and others like them, that's really the province to me of the classics. Those questions that are still pretty much the same in the realm of human experience. They're certainly not the only questions to ask. They may not even be the best questions to ask, but they're the questions that have kept the most people up at night for the longest time.
Yes, I think
and
that's,
in those books, we'll find some of the answers to those questions that have helped people get to sleep. So that's part of the education that I think off of the political spectrum is most important about engaging with these books.
Right. I mean, if you're reading one of these books, don't fall asleep in bed before you find out the meaning of life. That will be a great tragedy. But yeah, and I think also, so I had a parking lot aperçu about 30 minutes ago, pulling in here to the building. I was sitting in the parking lot thinking about Aristotle, thinking about Socrates because of you, Roosevelt. And I suddenly realized the umbilical line from Socrates to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Oh, because if you recall in the original Star Wars movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Darth Vader, "If you kill me, Darth, I will become even more powerful than you can imagine," or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And to me, I don't know, I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but one of the ways that I have trouble just thinking about one work at a time is it all seems very interconnected. If you read the Iliad, you'll understand the Sopranos a lot better. If you read Rousseau, you'll understand things that Lenny Bruce said a lot better. If you read Freud and then you read Philip Reif's critique of the therapeutic culture, you'll understand The Exorcist way better. And I don't mean to sort of pop culturize all this stuff, Roosevelt, but I also do think, to me, looking at one work without its interconnectedness, looking at Achebe's Things Fall Apart without thinking about Yeats, and then thinking about Hilary Mantel, who's inspired very much and in dialogue, I think implicitly with Achebe. To me, that's the exciting part, is the way everything speaks to everything else. But Roosevelt, take that and run with it.
No, I think that you're right, and that's what makes a canon valuable, because a canon is a collection of texts that are in some way related to each other, that are in some way in conversation with each other. And it's why it makes sense to speak or to read, say, the Western canon. And the Western is not the only canon, but it makes sense to pay attention to the textual foundations of a civilization. Because there is a great conversation. That's not my phrase, but it's been called the great conversation. There is a ongoing discussion and debate, examination, commentary. And when we read one of these books, we enter into that conversation. We become part of that conversation. I'm teaching some of these books. I'm teaching Socrates and Plato and Aristotle to high school students. Now, these are all high school students who come from low-income families, who are the first in their families who aspire to go to college. And when you hear these students grappling with Aristotle, grappling with Socrates' decision to not escape and to accept the death penalty that Athens has imposed on him, you see them connecting those issues to issues that are of contemporary relevance, that are alive to them right now. You see them entering that conversation. Forget the fact that today we might think of Aristotle as a white man or Socrates as a white man. Those categories are absolutely meaningless to in when you consider that the reason we read them is not because they're white men. It's because they spoke meaningfully, illuminatingly about questions that matter to us today, that we can have a sense of being part of this tremendous conversation that is larger than us, that we inherit and that we pass on. There is a tremendous sort of empowerment that comes from that, and also a sort of historical consciousness that puts your own contemporary problems, your own contemporary issues in this larger context, in this larger conversation. That is profoundly deepening to the student, profoundly deepening to the group that has this conversation.
I mean, it's also interesting. I think a lot of times people would reflexively toss your friend Augustine into that bucket of dead white men. It's actually a pretty open question about Augustine's race, what his identity would have been. I mean, that itself is kind of a fascinating conversation. What did it mean at that moment to be North African? What did Augustine probably look like, right? I mean,
exactly. I mean, he was African. He was North African. He was what today we would call a person of color. It really gives the lie to the idea that the Western canon is just a bunch of dead white men, because it's not. And not only Augustine, there are all kinds of influences that come from all over the Mediterranean. The Epic of Gilgamesh that Jim was just talking about. In what sense is that even European?
Right.
It's so true. The Western canon has a kind of cohesive, coherent conversation, but the idea that it is isolated, sealed off from the rest of the world, or that it is racially circumscribed, that it is a racial, ethno-cultural, unique, specific. It's just not the case. The reason why these works survive is precisely because they're able to transcend those historical specific conditions. I'm Dominican. I was born and grew up in the Dominican Republic. Augustine does not reflect my ethno-cultural signature, nor does Shakespeare, nor does Plato or Dante. But each of those writers can speak to me at the most profound level at which I recognize myself, because we're both human.
Yeah. So, Jim, if I had been a family member of yours or a friend of yours, I probably would have been one of the people saying, "Don't do this. This is going to be really hard." No doubt it was. But maybe you could say a little bit about that whole question of weighing, work after work after work after work, trying to figure out what its merits are, where it fits in, whether it's one of the 1,000. And I would imagine the more recent a work is, the more complex that is. I was kind of surprised to see, for example, I wasn't displeased, but because I knew her, but I was surprised to see Vicky Hearn's Adam's Task in there. That would have struck me maybe as a book that people got really excited about for kind of when it came out and maybe for a few years thereafter. I'm not sure I would know very many people who would remember it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. The more recent books, how do you decide what really belongs alongside Goethe or something?
Well, that's a great question, Colin, and it's a difficult one. And finally, I had to have a little, the way I approached it was 1,000 isn't enough to cover everything you want to cover. And it's also far too many to present a book in which you're saying you should read these books, and you don't want it to be an endless homework assignments. And so I tried to approach it in two different ways. One, most of my background is as a bookseller, saying if I could have a store with only 1,000 books, but I wanted something for everybody who wanted to come in and read something, whatever their interests, that's one lens I used. And the other one is I tried to reflect a reading life. And I think we often make reading seem more daunting than it is. And to me, uh, we read often the way we eat. Read for nourishment. We read and eat for distraction. And one day we'll be delighted with a little bag of potato chips, and the next day we'll want a gourmet meal. But all of that is part of what we're kind of taking in to fuel us and to delight us. And so I wanted that mix of books. So something like the Vicky Hearn and some of the other more newer ones were things that had struck me and readers I knew as being worth reading. I knew readers who were passionate about them, or I was passionate about them myself. And I wanted to put that in the hands of someone who might be interested in that particular subject.
I'm going to ask both of you about this. Speaking of relatively recent writers, I mean, one of the other things that I think we struggle with in the evaluation of writers is how many of their flaws to live with, and how many of the ways in which they seem to be out of sync with the present moment, and to what degree those things become a problem. I'm thinking in particular, and I'd love for both of you to talk about it. I'm thinking about Philip Roth. I think he's an interesting example. I mean, you could certainly make the argument that very few writers in the English language have written sentences as good and as powerful as Philip Roth's sentences. They are amazing, and many of the books are amazing as well. But there's this whole idea that, wow, he's kind of weird about women. There's a lot of hostility there. I mean, Megan Daum wrote a piece about going to a conference where she was excited to be on a panel about the human stain. It was a whole Roth conference, and she found out people didn't want to be on a panel about Roth because he was so radioactive, such a hot
That was
potato.
a great piece.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
saw that. Okay. So,
Yeah.
so Roosevelt, maybe start this. Maybe, so Roth isn't in the distant past. He's in the recent past. There are things about him that might be a little bit troubling, in light of the Me Too movement and other stuff as well. I don't know. Talk about how one should think about those things. I'd like to hear from both of you, but Roosevelt, start us off.
Yeah, I think first one has to draw a distinction between sort of the personal lives and foibles and failings of the writers, and then the works for what they do. And sometimes those spill into each other, for sure. But when we read a text that will deepen our humanity, that will illuminate the way that we experience ourselves and the way that we understand the world, we cannot filter out or sort of use a standard of some kind of moral purity, either for the writer or for the sort of our moral approbation of the ideas in the book. We're human, and our failings are as important in our process of self-knowledge as our successes, as what is admirable. So I think that all of these things are sort of grist for the mill. If you're going to read Roth, are there ways in which Roth's sort of attitudes towards women infiltrate, shape his narratives or his characters? Well, that's a fascinating question. And maybe there isn't, maybe there is, but having that argument and that conversation can be extraordinarily illuminating. What we should not do, what would be sort of self-defeating and shooting ourselves in the foot, is to say, well, then we shouldn't read Philip Roth because he was a misogynist, because he had these personal failings. We can say that pretty much of everybody. So we read these texts to learn about ourselves and to learn about them, but we don't read them to stand in judgment about the sort of to simply evaluate their moral rectitude. We do evaluate their moral rectitude, but we don't do so with a view to turning our gaze away from the places that we see failure. That's what an education is, right? An education exposes you to ideas that challenge you and to ideas that sometimes disturb you. Of course, we live in an environment where it's quite common to sort of cancel people or to object to on moral grounds to people and therefore silence them. And I think taking that attitude to the canon or to books is narrow-minded and self-defeating.
Yeah. So, Jim, I could have substituted for Philip Roth, Fred Exley. You've got a fan's notes in there.
Yep.
And I mean, maybe to Roosevelt's point, there's a way in which some authors are tellers. All authors are tellers, I guess, but some authors are exhibits too. Like Exley's a fan's note, or some of the stuff that Roosevelt was saying about Roth. It's like another room at the Peabody where you go in and you see what a kind of messed up but funny and entertaining white guy was like in 1970, or whenever a fan's notes came out. But Jim, yeah, just say how you're feeling about all this.
Well, I love that analogy that, they are exhibits in a natural history museum, and the nature we're talking about is human nature. So both in their flaws and in the brilliance of their writing, there are things that are worth looking at and pondering. Some of them are distasteful. Some of them are exhilarating. I mean, there are passages in Roth. You mentioned the sentences that he wrote. I once interviewed him, and I had to send him the transcript to the interview. We had done it over the phone, and I had to fax it to him. And he got the fax. He called me back, and he went through every sentence and kind of rewrote it. And he kept saying to me, "You see what I'm doing there?" And it was just the kind of scrutiny of the words and the energy of the writing is magnificent in its way. And it's moral purity is not something you're going to find in people who are engaging life on its own terms. Even St. Augustine said, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet."
Yeah. All right. We have to stop there. It's killing me, though. I mean, we've covered like 1/5 of what I wanted to get to, but maybe I can coax you to come back sometime. James Mustick is the author of 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die. Roosevelt Montaz is senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia, and the author of Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. Let's take a break. We'll continue this conversation with other people after this.
Encyclopedia Britannia? It wasn't Forever Umbriago. It was a book that was 3,857 pages thick. And I'm glad I took it. It fits perfectly under the short leg of my pool table. It wasn't a history. I know because it had no plot. It wasn't a mystery. Because nobody there got shot the day I read a book. I can't remember when, but one of these days I'm gonna do it again. Yes, one of these days I'm gonna do it again.
In times of many, when my heart rests on what is, canonically, famously, I cannot.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation right now with Gol Beckerman, the senior editor for books at The Atlantic. The Atlantic decided to kick or poke this particular hornet's nest and pick the great American novels across what, the 20th century and then forward to the 21st century. So, Gol Beckerman, first of all, maybe begin. Oh, it's since 1925. Okay. First one is The Great Gatsby. We go up to, I think, 2023. First of all, explain what was the impetus to do this? You know, you're just going to cause a lot of arguments, right?
Yeah, insanity. I don't know. Ambition that doesn't have any reason behind it. No, we thought it would be a fun exercise to look back over the last 100 years and try to identify what for us stands out as the so to speak great American novels. And the exercise was one that was undertaken really for the sake of doing the exercise, which I think is what the canon should be, how we should think about the canon in any case, as a process. The notion that there is a conversation to be had about which books have staying power, which books still speak to us today, which books will speak to us in the future. That was sort of why we did it, and just kind of as a fun challenge.
I have so many questions about this as well. But so, I mean, I'm also just kind of maybe extend the conversation I just had with the two other guests. I was wondering if there was, for example, a conversation had about Ayn Rand. who obviously causes some problems today and probably not all that fashionable for the Atlantic's core audience. I don't know. Did you have that conversation, and how did it go?
We did. We did. We had a conversation about her. We had a conversation about a few books sort of in the category that I would put her books in, which are books that perhaps had, or not perhaps, they did have a very strong sort of kind of ideological influence, or just a shaping sort of the world of ideas, particularly the way, the whole kind of libertarian sphere. So, but the conversation we had about these books was not just sort of were they influential in their time, because that would, I think, expand the boundaries in different ways. It was also, did they have sort of literary merit? Do we feel that on the face of it, an Ayn Rand book kind of has a certain quality, a certain literary quality? And I guess this is something one could argue about as well, but in our minds, we didn't see it as being important for that reason. I'll give you another book that was we didn't put on, that was controversial, and that will be more controversial for people probably than Ayn Rand, which is To Kill a Mockingbird, which we also kind of understood to be influential. Generations of children have read it in school, but when we looked back at the book, we thought, does this really stand up as sort of a literary artifact, as opposed to sort of a societal one? And it didn't, so we left it off.
What was sort of a white savior problem, part of the problem there? The idea, I mean, your list is very, very, I think it's weighted towards books that wrestle on a kind of a firsthand basis with race and identity. That's a book that wrestles with it from a very, very white perspective. Was that part of the problem?
You know what? Honestly, no. That wasn't the reason we didn't have it on there. We didn't have it on there because when we sort of took a look at it again, it just didn't sort of stand up from a literary perspective. And many of the people that we talked to sort of remembered it more for the movie that it inspired, or as sort of a pleasant, or sort of a moralistic sort of lesson that they were able to draw from it as kids reading it in school. So that wasn't the issue. But the what you say about sort of the list being weighted towards issues of race and identity, I mean, to the extent that a list like this over 100 years sort of captures the concerns and the preoccupations of Americans, yeah, we sort of saw that, as the decades rolled on, the big worries and debates that existed within American society were reflected in the novels.
There are some things in here that are, first of all, there are books that I never heard of.
Good.
And yes, exactly. And that's how I feel. I have never heard, this may expose something horrible about me. I have never heard of the Log of the SS, the Mrs. Unguentine by Stanley Crawford. Having read the synopsis that you provide of it, I'm keen to read it. But where did this book come from?
It's a crazy book. And we learned that was actually that you pick the one sort of most esoteric book on the list in some ways. And that book was new for me too, but that goes to a little bit of what our process was here, which was that we went out and we asked dozens and dozens of what we consider to be experts, novelists, critics, professors of American literature, to name the kind of the 5 novels that to them stand out over the last 100 years. And so for a few novelists, actually, interestingly, novelists picked this one book that most of us had never heard of before here. When we sort of investigated who the author was, it turns out that he was running, he'd sort of fallen into obscurity and was running a farmer's market in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But the book has an incredible quality. I mean, there's something so original and energetic about the style that that is also kind of completely surreal. Anyways, I recommend people pick it up. It was recently reissued, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book, one of the books there is a book that I read at the time. I don't think I grappled it with it very successfully. I've been meaning to get back to it. It's called Little Big or The Fairies' Parliament by John Crowley. That's also not a
Mhm.
super famous book, but it was a very intriguing choice. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're putting your finger on sort of one of the things we wanted to do here, which is, you know, this was a delicate balance. We wanted a list that uh, it would have certain books that would give it legitimacy. Like
hmm,
if The Great Gatsby was not on here, if Catch 22 was not on here, if authors like Joan Didion were not here or Toni Morrison were not here, then people would sort of not understand this to be a list doing the thing that we wanted to do. Um, but on the other hand, we really wanted it to be surprising. We wanted it to have qualities that would kind of force people to look at books that they maybe had never heard of before, that would introduce books that would be in conversation with those kind of better known books, and that would also provide a kind of fuller sense of what the canon or what we should think of the canon as, when it comes to who is part of it and what kinds of books exist within it. For that reason, we have books on here like, some children's literature too.
Charlotte's
Uh,
Web.
we have Charlotte's Web on here. We have A Wrinkle in Time, because they sort of met the standards that we set for this list.
Obviously, the closer you get to the present, the more troubled waters you're in, or the easier it is to make a mistake. You take some guts to pick a book from 2023. I even think of, it's not a novel, so it wouldn't have been in your conversation. But think about how Hillbilly Elegy was thought about in, I think, 2016
Hmm.
when it came out, and it's
Yeah.
just sort of been bubbling like this cauldron ever since, and people seeing different stuff in it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. You don't necessarily have to talk about J.D. Vance, but books, particularly books that have been, books that are still kind of being digested by the great
Yeah.
python of readership.
Yeah.
They're in a different kind of category, I think.
Well, I mean, it was quite challenging to pick those books from the last 15 years. That was probably our biggest difficulty, because we were projecting forward, in ways that are hard to do about what will actually have staying power and what people will be reading in 50 years, 100 years from now. So when I look at our picks from the 2010s and the aughts, up until last year. These are all books that are incredibly ambitious, are books in which it was clear that the authors were trying to do something totally original with the form. Maybe it's weighted a little bit too heavily in that direction, towards kind of experimentation, or just sort of pure ambition in storytelling. And that there's something sort of quieter that we missed. But that's what stood out for us in terms of books that we kind of had a sense people will still be reading and thinking about in years to come.
I've got sort of time for one more subject, and I think that would be your own experience in terms of the books that you wound up reading that you hadn't read. Was there a particular book that you wouldn't have read under other circumstances that's now important to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of them on this list. There's one book from the 1930s that I sort of discovered through this process that I didn't even had never even known about, called East Goes West by Young-Hil Kang, who was a Korean American. It's this kind of picaresque journey through America by a Korean immigrant. And if you would have asked me, I wouldn't even have sort of imagined that there was sort of an Asian American literature at in the
Hmm.
1930s. But this book is a fabulous book. I mean, he's really such a great writer, and he's capturing America in this from this perspective that I had never really read before. Another one that I really loved. I'm a fan of noir, like 40s, 30s, 40s noir crime novels. And there's a book called In a Lonely Place by Dorothy Hughes, which is just fantastic. It was also made into a great movie. But it's kind of one of the rare sort of women noir writers from the time. and just paints this incredible picture of Los Angeles, of sort of a post-war world of traumatized soldiers returning from World War II, and sort of this kind of underbelly in the city at the time. So there's so many books here that I discovered through this process.
It's a fascinating list, and it is a great reading list for all of us. I think there's so many that I haven't read there. So Gol Beckerman is the senior editor for books at The Atlantic. By all means, check out the great American novels in The Atlantic, and then write him a very angry email because he picked the wrong Vonnegut novel or something. All right, thanks for being with. He loves getting angry emails, though. So
I know. That's part of how we knew we succeeded with this, is people were arguing with us.
Don't hold back. All right, thanks very much for joining us. We'll take a break. We'll come back with our final segment.
Parents well, their children's hell will slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they fix, the one you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why. If they told you, you would cry. So just look at them and sigh.
So, speaking of Obi-Wan Kenobi, our technical producer today is Eugene Amatruda, and the producer of this episode is the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, Lily Tyson. Joining us now is someone we've been delighted to have on before, Laura Kipnis, a cultural critic and essayist and the author of Love in the Time of Contagion, A Diagnosis, among other books. But she's here today to talk about something called Rebind Publishing, an interactive reading experience, which if I attempt to describe, I will do a poor job, and she would do it so much better. So, Laura Kipnis, maybe begin by explaining exactly what this is. It's a little bit hard to wrap one's mind around.
Hi, Colin.
Hi.
Nice to be back on. So I was asked to participate in this AI startup called Rebind, and it has to do with, and I should insert here, I have all the usual trepidations and ambivalences about AI, but this one seems to be using it for an interesting purpose, partly which is to kind of revivify the canon and keep the classics alive. So it has to do with getting authors. Margaret Atwood is one, a whole host of others who have strong points of view, and getting them to read a book from the canon, which is out of copyright. And then on this app called Rebind, Margaret, say, would record like a dozen hours of commentary. She's doing a book from Dickens. I think it might be Tale of Two Cities.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I did Romeo and Juliet. So you record about 12 hours of commentary, and it's embedded in the book. So a reader on the app is reading through the book and able to communicate with you, the rebinder, like Margaret or I, and ask us questions and talk to us about our views of the book. And so AI takes that commentary and kind of recombines it and puts it in dialogue with the reader. Does that sort of make sense?
No, I
It
think
is
you
a
did
little hard to explain.
you did a very good job. Would you
Thank
just
you.
love to replace Alexa with Margaret Atwood? You know, you just ask Alexa, what's the temperature today? You know, but Margaret Atwood would tell you. I'll tell you what
I
the
think we're
temperature
on the cusp of that, right? Or
So
Rudy Giuliani doing our phone messages.
right. I think it's true that for the two founders of this, the kind of the first example they thought of just to try to describe what it was going to be was you talking about Romeo and Juliet, right? When they were sort of trying to explain to each other what they were doing. What if Laura Kipnis could answer questions and engage in a dialogue, a Laura Kipnis bot? So explain, I don't know, when you approached this whole task, what were you thinking about? How did you, this is a new job. It didn't exist before right now. So how did you think about the job?
Well, it for sure didn't exist in my imagination. I mean, I am no kind of Shakespearean or even a lit person. And it struck me as incredibly eccentric of them to ask me to do this, because my relation to love is having written a book a long time ago called Against Love, which
Yes.
is a sort of cynical pro-adultery, I suppose, take on modern coupledom. And so I read Romeo and Juliet very carefully. And I mean, I honestly had never taken a Shakespeare course. As I say, in my commentary, I did one time date a Shakespearean who used to say that Shakespeareans weren't that smart. So it sort of reassured me. But I mean, I spent a long time just going through the text line by line and consulting with a modern version of it and watching the movie. So I started becoming, familiar, certainly with the story. The language was more difficult. And then I just went through it thoroughly and recorded this commentary. And I mean, along the way, you just get you start to develop your own take on it. And, one of the things that it struck me that it's just so much of a weirder play and a weirder story with weirder characters and events than I had remembered. And I think that most people are taught because we approach the classics with this kind of reverence. And what was great about the Rebind team was that they just encouraged me to say what came to my mind and take my own independent view on it rather than quoting experts or pretending to be some kind of authority. So that was fun, to engage like in this idiosyncratic way with this classic.
Reading about this brought back a memory for me when my son was maybe about 10, 9 or 10, because I'm a very bad parent. He and his friend Natalie, also, she was probably 10 or 11, watched Romeo and Juliet, the Baz Luhrmann version where they have guns and John Leguizamo as Tybalt and all that stuff. And at the end, they had no idea what was coming. Then at the end, my son, who gets nervous when something happens that appalls him, just started kind of saying very fast, why did they do that? Just because one person is dead, the other person shouldn't have to die. Just because the first person, would you die just because another person was dead? And then Natalie finally said, but they were together. And I thought, wow, they're having this really primal conversation that would be so interesting to have interact with a Laura Kipnis bot.
Thank you. Well, yeah, it's a play with a very high body count, which you forget. And I mean, I did end up thinking, not to like spoil the ending, but there is a punitive quality to the ending. And that was something I thought about a lot. Like to what degree was Shakespeare wanting to actually punish these characters for transgressing, social norms and the desires of their family? And yes, they end up together. On the other hand, they're dead.
Yeah, to me, one possible interpretation is Shakespeare is kind of, maybe by proxy or something, freaking out about adolescent sexuality. This is what happens. This is what happens when you let these kids, turn their passions loose on one another and society. They're out of control and they're disruptive. But there are about 18 other possible ways of thinking about this. And I guess you can only go so far with the format of Rebind.
Well, you could go pretty far, and I think I did. And I did do some reading and had some familiarity with the history of, let's say, individuality. And it did strike me that this play is written and first produced like right at the time when this kind of new character or person we think of as the modern individual is being invented, who has the desire to act according to their own needs and individuality as opposed to just according to custom or the wishes of their family. And so the play is really like, I think, a turning point in that, but it's also very ambivalent about these new forms of freedom. So I was kind of gassing on or waxing on about like the rise of democratic movements for political rights and, that this play, I think, is, as I say, kind of a turning point where you start thinking of the individual as someone with rights. So there's a political reading too, and I tried to get into that.
I only have about 35, 40 seconds left, but I'd love for you to just say a little bit about existentially what it's like to have this slightly alternative version of yourself, which is something I suppose we all have to get used to.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I kind of a fatalist about all of this. I mean, AI is not, there's no turning back from this. And I honestly have actually found that Chat GPT and, the apps are kind of helpful for doing research. So, yes, they're soon going to be ruling us and taking over everything. On the other hand, it's a great research tool in the meantime.
Right. That's why it's so funny that Margaret Atwood did this. Anyway, we have to take a break. We have to leave. We have to say goodbye. I'm very disoriented now. Laura Kipnis, it is so great to hear your voice once again. The whole thing is fascinating. Laura Kipnis is the author of, among other books, Love in the Time of Contagion, A Diagnosis. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to everybody who listened. We will be back tomorrow.
E. Allan Poe, ho, 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 did it, but he did it in verse. H. Beecher Stowe did it, but she had to rehearse. Tennessee Williams, self-taught, does it. Kinsey with a deafening report, does it. Let's do it, let's fall in love. In the spring of the year, inhibitions disappear and our hearts beat high. We had better face facts, every gland that overacts has an alibi. For each bird and each bee, each slap happy, sappy.